In this video, we're going to talk about client-server environments. The client-server architecture is a distributed computer-based system where responsibility is shared between the software on the server side as well as the software on the client computer. Let's go into the server side now. So on the server side, the server's software will listen and accept any requests that come in from the client or several clients. The server may have to communicate with a database to get data before it responds to the request. So the database returns some kind of the result from some kind of a query, and that goes back to the server software. So the server software will pick that up, and then it will build some kind of a response. And so now the server will then process that data and respond to the client. But what happens on the client side? Well, let's take a look. On the client side, it is up to the client to make the request to a server. Then the server will acknowledge that request and may ask the client for data to complete the task. So even though the client make the request, the server side may not have enough information to help the client. So we may ask for more information. So the client will then provide the data, and then it will then wait for an answer from the server side, which may have to talk to the database. But in the end, the server processes that data and sends the result back to the client. Let's talk now more about the server-side software. So scripts are not visible on the server side, but its output is usually in the form of HTML. So we may not see the actual code that is running in the backend, but the backend will then formulate some kind of a response, and that response will usually be in an HTML format. Backend scripting can customize the responses, and this is done because it has so much power. It has the database, it has the logic that is built into the software. So on the back end, the server-side scripting can customize the responses that we send back to the client. Now, scripts are secure. They're secure in the fact that they're running on a server and they don't have direct public access. They also communicate or interact with databases so that we can customize the responses. Now, client-side scripting is not that secure. In fact, the source code can be visible. Now, we do have faster response times on the scripting on the client side because the client software, JavaScript mainly, runs on the computer, on the user's computer. So it does not have to compete with anything except whatever the computer is running at the time. Now, there's not much security on the client side, but of course this is relative to the server side. On the server side, we have both the server-side software, which may be a separate machine, from the database, which may be running on a separate machine. So those two machines, or those two pieces of software, need to be very secure. On the client side, though, the browser can actually turn off any kind of JavaScripting security that we may have. We may write into the code. In the end, though, both systems are supposed to work together, and we're supposed to achieve some kind of security on the client side. And once we send that to the server is supposed to perform its own checks. But in the end, everything should work smoothly, and the user should not be affected by the security on both sides of the system. In this video, I'd like to talk about JavaScript. The original intent and purpose of JavaScript was to work on the browser. It was supposed to create interactivity with that web page. But now it's on the back end. In fact, it supports Node.js and Apache CouchDB. JavaScript is just like C, C++, Java in terms of the style of the language, but it is a function-based language. So all of the functions that you write in JavaScript are supposed to be first-class functions. Let's go a little bit into the history of JavaScript. Originally, it was created by Netscape, and it was called Mocha in 1995. Then the name changed to LiveScript, and now finally it's called JavaScript. ECMAScript, which is a European-based body, it's an organization, they accepted responsibility for JavaScript development in 1997. They released version 2 in 1998 and version 3 in 1999. Now, Ajax, a very special technology which allows the web page to refresh itself or to update itself in the background without the browser itself refreshing, that's a Microsoft technology. It was developed by Microsoft. However, Microsoft chose JavaScript to be the main implementer of Ajax. This all occurred in 2005. Now, another development in that year was the development of Jquery. Jquery is a library and it uses JavaScript in the background. However, Jquery made it a lot easier to work with the DOM, the Document Object Model, which we'll talk about shortly. In 2008, Google released its Chrome browser, and that had a JavaScript-based V8 engine in it. So as you might expect, JavaScript is important. Let's talk now about the importance of JavaScript. So it is running in the browser, or it is supposed to run in the browser, and it can make an ordinary, dull HTML page come alive in a dynamic way because we can interact with all of the pieces of the web page. In fact, JavaScript gives developers control over the DOM. The DOM stands for Document Object Model, and that's a feature that we'll talk about a little bit later on in the course. But what it does is that the DOM looks at the web page as a series of relational objects. And so JavaScript can access those objects. JavaScript is now part of the server-side programming language. I mentioned Node.js before. So Node.js is a server-side programming language. It can handle requests from the client. Several browser APIs are now available in HTML5. These were made available to JavaScript. So we're talking authentication, storage, and something called geolocation. And these are just a few that I mentioned. There are several more. Now, when it comes to dynamic HTML with JavaScript, the way it works is that JavaScript can target any part of the document object model. In the example shown on the screen at the moment, the body tag is an object, and so it has events on it. And one of the events of that body object is that it can be loaded onto the browser screen. So JavaScript can take advantage of this onload event, and in this case, we can pop a hello onto the web page. Now, in this case here, the JavaScript itself, the function alert, is built into the document object. However, there is another more sophisticated way, or I guess a more efficient way of adding JavaScript to your web pages, and that is via the JavaScript properties. So in this case, we have added a script tag to the head tag, or inside of the head tags, and there we are pointing to an external JavaScript file called myjsfunctions.js. In this video, I'd like to talk about JavaScript as a programming language. Now, the word script is part of JavaScript, and you might think that it does not function like a regular programming language. Well, it does function like a regular programming language. In fact, we've got variables that we can use, there are functions, and of course, we have all of the various programming constructs. So variables can be declared and initialized. Functions are considered to be first-class functions in JavaScript. I'll explain that in a moment. And of course, we have all of the various constructs of programming languages like sequencing, decision-making. That's where we use the if-then structure. And we have iteration. That's where we can loop through or loop over a collection of data. Now, I did say that functions are first-class citizens. And what that means is that we can assign a function to a variable. Also, we can return a function from another function. So in this way, functions in JavaScript are considered first-class functions. Let's talk a little bit more about variables. So variables in JavaScript work like variables in any other function, in any other programming language. Variables are used to store values. That's it. Also, JavaScript natively supports 3 basic types. Now, you may think that because it supports 3 basic types, it's not a full-fledged programming language. But there are variations on these. So the basic ones are, of course, numeric, string, where we use double quotation marks, and objects. Then we have constant variables. Now, the constant variable type was not supported initially. But now, recently, with the last version of ECMAScript, so version 6, they did introduce the const variable type. So now we have a constant variable type that we can use. meaning that once we've declared a const, then the value that's inside of that variable cannot change during the running of the program. Literals work just like any other programming language. They are either numbers, strings, characters. Of course, strings are inside of double quotation marks. And just like any other programming language, literals are used, but they're not assigned to any variable as such. Let's take a look now at a short program in JavaScript. And starting at line 1, we see that we can declare a variable. All this means is that somewhere in memory, an address will be picked, and that address will have a label of X in it. Later on line number 2, we can assign a value to that location. So in this case, on line 1, we declare X. On line 2, we initialize it with the value of 5. On the third line, we've declared and initialized a variable, a string variable, and then we've initialized it to the value of John. Then further down on line number 4, we've declared another variable and initialized it with a different word. Now you notice that there are two types of declarations here, var and let. And the difference has to do with scope. We will talk more about it when we get into the demos. So the vars are considered to be globally scoped, whereas the lets are considered to be scoped within the curly braces. And here on line 5, we see the const that I previously mentioned. In this case here, days of the week will be initialized with a value of 7, and it is not supposed to change during the running of the program. So JavaScript may not have all of the power of a programming language like Java or C#, but it does have all of the features of a regular programming language. And as JavaScript developers, this is all we really need to get our jobs done. In this video, I'd like to talk about a few features of JavaScript, starting with functions. Functions in JavaScript work like any other programming language. They are a block of code that is used to perform a particular task. Functions are considered first-class objects or first-class citizens in JavaScript. And the reason for this is because a function in JavaScript can be assigned to a variable. That variable can then be passed around or passed into another function. And also, functions can be returned as the return of another function. JavaScript function is defined starting with the function keyword. So that's a keyword. You can't use that to name a variable. And you're going to have the name, of course, so whatever name you chose for your function, that comes next, and then parentheses. The code inside a function will run only when some other part of the program calls it. So you define your function, and it just sits there until another part of your program decides to call or invoke that function. Let's now take a look at another feature of JavaScript. Let's take a look at classes. This feature was introduced in ECMAScript 2015, shortened to ES6. And as you can see here, we have defined a class, and we've given it a name. The name of the class is course, and we have curly braces to define the scope of that course class. There's a constructor and one function in this class. If you wanted to use this class or create an object from this class, you simply use the new keyword. So at the very last line, we see that we have a new course being added or being created, and the two parameters are being passed in JavaScript and the instructor as Axel. Now, as with any other programming language, JavaScript also has arrays and objects, and we saw the version of that on the previous slide. Arrays, of course, are used to store multiple values in one data structure, and we can manipulate arrays or array values through array functions, and there are quite a few of them. Objects can also be used in JavaScript, and on the next slide, you'll see an example of an object. Here we see some code, and the first line of code, of course, is an array, and it is a string array. And we also see below that an array of integer values. And after that, we see a lot of different functions, built-in functions. These functions come with JavaScript. And for example, we can sort the array. We can find the length of the courses array. We can do things like push and pop. Finally, the very last structure that you see there is an object. As you can see, we have a variable pointing to an object. The object is defined within those curly braces. And as you can see, it is really just name value pairs. In this demonstration, we're going to create a JavaScript array and then use it on our web page. What we have on the screen right now is Notepad++ on the left, as well as Firefox web browser on the right. Any changes I make to the HTML JavaScript file or CSS will be reflected once we refresh our Firefox web browser. Now, in previous demonstrations, I did mention how to add JavaScript to your web pages. And for this demonstration, we're going to use an external JavaScript file. I'm going to open up my Windows Explorer window now to show you where that file is located. So here we are in Windows Explorer. And as you can see now, I have three files. So my demo.html file, as well as my CSS from previous demonstrations, and then my JavaScript file. The JavaScript file can be created simply by right-clicking on any of the white space in the Explorer, and then choose the New option from the pop-up menu. From that new option, choose Text Document. Click on Text Document. You will get a text document like this. You can change the name as well as the extension of that document. I'll just delete this for the moment because I've already created my scripts.js file. Let's switch back now to Notepad++. So back on Notepad++, I can now attach that external JavaScript file I just showed you into the demo.html file. Now we can do this in several different places. In this case, I'm going to add it to my head tag. So between my head tags, I'll include a pair of script tags, opening and closing. Then on the very first script tag, there is a source attribute. We can give it a value of wherever our scripts file is located. Now our scripts.js file happens to be in the same folder as demo.html file, so I don't need any special paths to get to it. I simply need to include the name of the file. So now anything that I create in that JavaScript file will be attached to my demo.html file. I'll just save these changes. Now I'm going to switch over to the scripts.js file, which I just created. And notice that it is completely empty at the moment. Let's add in an array using the var keyword. So this is one of those keywords that we can use to define variables. So we can define our courses array just like any other variable with the equal sign. But instead of having just the value, we can add a pair of square brackets. Now we can start adding in our elements into that array. So for example, I may add a few strings into this array. Notice that each element is separated by a comma. Once I have that, I can then insert my strings. So let's have a few courses here. So Angular, React, Vue, JavaScript, and Python. So I have 5 courses string array, 5 courses in my array. They're all string values. So the name of my array is courses array. Let's head back. First, let's save this. So Control S will save our scripts.js file. Back in the demo.html file, I can now use that scripts array. So where do I want to use it? Well, perhaps I just wanted to use it right after the here are courses. So on line 14, I'm going to insert a pair of div tags there. And then between the div tags, I will also insert a pair of script tags. These script tags will indicate to the browser that I'm running a script here. So in between the script tags, I can start writing out my whatever it is I need to do. So in this case, I'm going to write out a for loop. So a for loop in JavaScript starts with the keyword for, curly parentheses, and inside the parentheses, we are going to have 3 statements. So they're separated out by semicolons. So then after that, we're going to have our curly braces where we will insert our logic for this for loop. So let's start out with some kind of an index. I'm using X here, but we can use anything else. We can use E for element or I, but let's start it out at 0. And then what we want to do is make sure that that X, that index, never crosses the courses array dot length, because the length will give us the amount of elements in it's a property of the array that comes with JavaScript. It comes with the array once you declare it. Then our last piece of code here will be to increment our X. So X++ will simply increment our X each time we go through an element of the array. Once we have that, we can then display the array value using something called document.write. Now, this is another function that we did not have to import or do anything with. It comes with JavaScript. So document.write is a function. So let's include the parentheses. Let's end our statement. And inside of those parentheses, we can now target our array. So remember, it's courses array. And if we use the square brackets, as well as our x, which is our index, we should get each element of the array. Let's save this now, refresh our browser screen, and we in fact do get each element of the array. Now it doesn't look nice at the moment, so what we could do is we can add a few things. So for example, I've added in here just by concatenating a pair of parentheses, a pair of double quotation marks. We can then include a comma and a space. And if I were to save this now, refresh the browser screen, notice that it looks a lot better. However, notice that our line is sort of touching the next line down, and if we wanted to, we can use the same document.write to include some HTML. Yes, it is possible to use JavaScript to insert HTML into the document. So the same document.write, we can use those double quotation marks and include a pair of paragraph tags, an opening and closing paragraph tag. Then when we save that, refresh our browser screen, notice that the paragraph tag inserted a space above the choose our course. So in this way, we can add JavaScript to our HTML document, and there are a lot more functions that we can use with Array. As the course continues, we may use a few more of those functions. In this demonstration, we're going to work with JavaScript functions and also the DOM as well as variables. What we have on the left side of your screen is our Notepad++ application. There are two files opened up there, demo.html as well as scripts.js. On the right side of your screen, we have our Firefox web browser showing or rendering any changes we make to that HTML or the JavaScript file. What I'd like to do in this demonstration is show an upcoming course. So if you notice in our HTML document, on our browser actually, notice that we have a few items, a few input boxes as well as radio buttons. Down at the bottom, I'd like to include another label with the upcoming courses that we're going to be offering. So how do we do that? If I scroll down to where we have this section that is bordered right now, we've got two pairs of div tags there. I'm going to add another pair of div tags that will act as the area where I can insert my label. So notice that on lines 45 to 47, I've included a pair of div tags, as well as now I'm including the label tags on line 46. So we have an opening and closing label tag, and I will include some text between the label tags that shows upcoming courses. Now let's create another div tag a little bit lower down. Now I will give this div tag an ID because if you remember, JavaScript functions do target items or HTML tags via their IDs. Now, of course, there are other ways of doing this as well, but for now, let's just focus on the ID. So I will give it an ID, but I won't be using the ID for the first part of the demo. What we'll do at the first part of the demo is we'll do something that we've done before. So on line number 49, I will include a pair of script tags. So when the HTML document, when the browser sees these script tags, it will run the script that's in between the script tags, and it will perform whatever actions we have there. The action that I'm going to include in between the div tags is the document.write method. We've seen this before. Once JavaScript sees document.write, it's a method, so let's include a parentheses. It will then write out whatever we have in between the parentheses to the div tags, which appear on lines 48 and 50. Now, let's go back now into our scripts.js tag file. At the moment, it's completely empty. But let's declare a variable using the var keyword. Let's call our variable next course, and we will assign it or initialize it with the value of TypeScript. So this is going to be our next course. I will save the JavaScript file. Right now we have just this one line here. Back on the demo.html file, let us now include inside or in between the parentheses, let us pass our next course. Remember, both these files are connected by our line number 8, where we have our script tags pointing to scripts.js. So both of these files are connected. So now that I've got all of my scripts in place and my HTML in place, let's refresh the browser screen to see what we get. And there it is, upcoming courses, TypeScript. So I was able to do this using just the document.write. Now I'm going to show you a different way to do this. In fact, let us now remove the script tags from line 49 and just leave an empty pair of div tags with an ID of future courses. I'll save that change. Now if I refresh the browser, TypeScript will disappear. But that's okay. We're going to go back into our scripts.js file now and prepare a function to do the same thing. Now, when you create an HTML document, you get the DOM for free. So the DOM comes with every HTML document that you get. And there is an object on the DOM called the window object. And from a JavaScript point of view, we can access that window object. In fact, we can even access the onload event of that window object. What we can do at this point is we can point that to a function that we are going to write. So on line number 4, it's window.onload equal to function, the function keyword. Now remember, a function has parentheses and it has a function body. But it also has a function name. So the name for our function is showNextCourse. Now in between the curly braces, we can write in our logic. What do we want to do? Well, first of all, we want to target that HTML, that div tag in the HTML document. Switch over quickly to the demo.html file. Show you that on line 48, we do have a div tag there, and it has an ID of future courses. So in my scripts, I can target that. But I need to go through the document first. Remember, the document comes with every HTML document that we create. It comes for free. It's there. So document.getElementById happens to be one of the most important methods of the document object. GetElementById, what you do is, it's a method. So let's add our parentheses. And you pass it a name or an ID or something like that on the HTML document. And document.getElementById will now give you a handle to that object, meaning that you can access its properties, such as the inner HTML property. And you can pass it something, like in this case, we're passing it next course, which has a value of TypeScript. So that inner HTML property, it will write out in between the pair of div tags anything that we pass to it, in this case, TypeScript. So let's save this change. Let's refresh our browser and notice that TypeScript returned to the div tag that we had earlier. In this demonstration, we're going to work with JavaScript Functions and the document object model. On the left of your page, we have our Notepad++ with two files opened up, demo.html and scripts.js. On the right side of your screen, we have our Firefox browser. Whenever I make a change to the demo.html, we'll refresh our browser to see that change. Back over in demo.html, notice that on line number 8, we have pair of script tags and pointing to the scripts.js file. That scripts.js file is the second tab I have opened up in my Notepad++, and at the moment it is completely empty. Let us now create a function here, and we start with the function keyword. And because it's a function, we'll have parentheses as well as curly braces. Let's give our function a name, so let's call it choiceMade. I expect for this function to accept or to receive one parameter, so let's give that parameter a name. Let's call it choice. Now when I do get my choice, what I want to have happen is I'd like to have the alert function fired. Remember, the alert function comes with JavaScript. We didn't have to import it or do anything else. It comes automatically with JavaScript. What I can do is pass a string. So let's say that I have a string called choiceMade. Notice I have a space after made. And then I'm going to concatenate whatever value I get from choice. So I have a function. That function receives a parameter. And I'm going to do one thing in this function, which is alert or create a message box to appear on the browser's page. So when this function is fired, the alert will pop up a message on the browser window. Let's complete this statement on line number 3, save the changes, and go back into demo.html and interact with this function. Now, when you create a document like demo.html, automatically you will have a parent document available to you. That document will then have children like the HTML tags, the head tags, the body tags, and every other tag within this document. That's called the document object model. So on line number 19, we do have a pair of select tags there, starting on line 19, ending on line 26. And that select HTML tag is a document, is an object in itself. It has properties. As you can see, it has an ID of courses. It has a size of 3. What we can do now is tap into the methods of this object, or events, because it's called events, not methods, in HTML. So let us now tap into one of the events called the onChange event. That means that whenever the user clicks on one of the choices within that drop-down list box, the onChange event will fire. Now this happens automatically. We did not have to do anything to cause this to happen. What we could do, however, is point this onChange event to our function. So the function will be inserted as the value. Remember choice made? We just created that function on scripts.js. It's a function, so let's include our parentheses. Now, if you remember, that choice made function was requiring some kind of a value. It could be an integer, it could be a string. In this case, it will be a string. What we'd like to pass to choice made function is the actual value that the user clicked on. Now, there are a couple of different ways that we can get this, but one of the ways is that we could use the this operator or the this keyword. So when we use this within the angle brackets of an HTML tag, it means that the this refers to that tag. So if I were to use this inside of my choice made function call, this will represent the select box with an ID of courses. Now, what I also want to pass to the function is the value that the user clicked on. So it could be Angular, React, Vue, etc. Let's save these changes now, refresh our browser screen, and let's see if this works. If I click on React, we get a message box that pops up, says that the choice made was React. Let's click OK here, and let's do something a little bit more interesting. Let's take the value that the user clicked on and put it into the input box. Now remember, JavaScript has access to the DOM, the document object model. And our input box also has an ID. It's called, let's see, course name. So we could target this input box on line number 36 and cause the option that the user clicked on to be populated inside of that input box. Let's see how we do that. Let's click back over into the scripts.js file. And the first thing we want to do is create line number 3. Let's turn that into a comment so it doesn't keep popping up every time. And what we want to use now is the document, because remember the document acts as the parent. And there's a function of that document called getElementById, meaning that we can get any part of the DOM as long as it has an ID associated with it. So remember, our favorite course has an ID of course name. So by passing in the course name into getElementById, we are able to now target that particular input box, meaning that we have access to its properties and methods. And one of the properties is value. So I can target that value and point it to or cause the choice that was passed in from the document to be populated inside of that value property. Let's finish the statement, save the changes, and let me go over to the browser, make sure I click in the URL box and hit the enter key. That refreshes the entire document. You can also refresh using the refresh notation or the refresh icon, and that will refresh the page as well. Now, if I were to, let's say, click on Vue.js, notice that Vue.js shows up in the favorite courses input box. So in this way, we can use JavaScript to target any part of our DOM and manipulate that DOM. In this video, I'd like to talk about form validation, a very important topic when it comes to web development. With form validation, what we're trying to achieve is we're trying to check all of the values that the user has entered into a form, an HTML, and we check this data, these values, before it gets to our backend. Because what could happen is that some of these values could end up in our database. And if our database is not prepared or configured to work with that type of data, then we could have a problem in the entire application. So as users enter data onto the form, the browser itself attempts to check each value that they enter and validate that within certain parameters, like is it too long, is it too big, is it too small? And these parameters are usually set by the programmer. Now, once you create an HTML document, if you're using HTML5, you get a few validation features that occur automatically. For example, the required feature. This goes in to a field like an input box as an attribute. And if an input box has this attribute in it, it means that the user must enter some kind of a value into that box before they can submit the form. So in other words, this prevents users from entering or from submitting form fields that does not have anything in it. In other words, the form fields are empty. Then there's something called min length and max length. These are attributes as well. And what these checks will do is they will check the amount of characters that the user has entered into those input boxes. So it'll check for the number of characters, meaning that it can only have a minimum length or a maximum length, and it will check for that length. So if the min length is, let's say, 5, and you entered 4, then that would raise some kind of an issue and you won't be able to submit that form. Also, there are min and max values, not to be confused with min length and max length. So what min and max do is that they would check the value itself to make sure that it is within a specific range. So in other words, if you're entering an age, it should not be less than 1. Another feature of HTML5 and its validation capabilities is that it has the ability to check for certain patterns. Take, for example, a telephone number in North America. It's usually written with 3 digits, then a dash, then 3 more digits, another dash, and then 4 digits at the end. So we can configure the HTML document to look for that specific pattern. Now, apart from the patterns that come with HTML, we also have the ability to extend that by writing our own patterns. So with regular expressions, we are able to customize that pattern recognition validation. And for example, let's say we had an input box that accepts streets or lanes or roads, and we expect that the user would enter something like Main Street. Then we can have a pattern recognition that looks for the street or the road after the name, which is main in this case, and we can have a regular expression that checks for that. So in this case, we have extended what came with HTML automatically or by default, and now we can customize the patterns that we would like to look for in the input fields. Let's take a look now at some code that has some validation in it. So what we have here is a function called validate, and we have a form called myForm. Now, once you create a form, anything that's created inside of the form tags become part of the form. So as you can see here, the form itself is an object. It has a name property, and that name property has a value property on it. So we can actually check the name of the form or the value that comes with the name of that form to make sure that it is not blank, because if it is blank, we can return false from this validate function. In our next check, the telephone input field is part of the myForm, and that in itself has a value, and the value itself has a length property. So what we could do is we can check the length of the value of the telephone input field within this form to make sure that it is less than 10. Because if it is more than 10, it is probably not a valid North American telephone number, and we should return false from this check. Now our third check is checking a checkbox. Now once we have a checkbox, we can give it an ID, let's say is favorite. And once we have a checkbox on our form, well, that checkbox can have one of two states. It's either checked by the user or it's unchecked, meaning the user never touched it. So what we could do is we can check the checked property of that checkbox to see if it's false or true. If it's true, it means that it's checked. So in this case here, what we're saying is that if the user did not check it, then we are going to return false, and therefore the validate function will return false. Now, if all of these checks that we have on the validate function, if they all pass, then we simply return true to whichever function is listening to this validate function. And if that happens, it probably means that the form can be submitted. In this demonstration, I'm going to use form validation to check the fields or the values on our form. On the left of your screen, we have Notepad++. We have 2 files open up there. On the right of your screen, we have our browser. It's rendering any changes we make to the files on the left. The files on the left have been used in a previous demonstration. It's a form. It has quite a few fields in it. We have a drop-down list box. We have 2 input boxes, as well as some radio buttons and a send button. Let's first of all give a name to our form. So on line 14, we have our form tag there, the opening form tag. And I'm going to give that form tag a name. So let's add a name. Let's call it feedback. So notice that name is an attribute, and whatever we put inside of those double quotation marks will become the name of the form. Now that form will act as a parent to the rest of the form controls in this form. So let us now go to our favorite instructor, that input box. So on line 32, that's our input box for instructor name. And what we'll do is we'll add the required attribute there. Remember, required comes with HTML5. We do not have to do anything to make it work, except to use it. We'll also add a required to the input field on line 36. So now both of these fields are required, meaning that if I try to click that send button, I should get a message. Let's save these 2 changes by hitting Ctrl+S on the keyboard, heading back over to our browser, refresh the page, and let's click on send first of all without putting anything into those 2 boxes. And notice immediately I get some feedback. It says, please fill out this field. Now I can enter anything in here. I can enter a number or a letter. Let's put A there. And let's click on send. Now I get the message on the second field, favorite course. Again, I can just enter anything in there. If I click on send now, both of these fields were submitted. Let's add a few more features. So back over on the form, let us add the min length. So in other words, I'd like the user to enter a minimum length for favorite instructor. And the minimum length I'd like them to enter is 4. Now I will say that the numbers that I'm entering here are they're not true to how it would be in the real world, but these are just for demonstration purposes only. So I'm just saying that for now, let's have a minimum length of 4 favorite instructor. I'll save those changes. Now I'll have to do a hard refresh on this browser just to make sure that the changes got picked up. Now again, if I click on send, it will tell me to fill out the instructor field. If I fill out the instructor field with just an A, notice that it tells me please use at least 4 characters. So let's enter AXLE. And if I click on send now, it should pass the favorite instructor. And now it moves on to the favorite course where I'm supposed to fill out that field there. Let's add another validation, the HTML5 validation now. So these are native validations of max length. So let's add a max length of, let's say, 6 characters. So I'll click Control S on the keyboard to save that change. And now if I refresh the browser, let's do Axel over here on the instructor field so that we pass that particular test. And for favorite course, let's don't put anything there. Let's click on send. The first thing it tells me is to fill out this field. Now, if I try to enter something like JavaScript, let's see what will happen. JAVASCRI. Notice it's not letting me put anything else in there. There are only 6 letters allowed because my max length is 6. So this is the way the native default validations that comes with HTML5 work. Let's turn our attention now to JavaScript functions and how we can write our own functions to do our own validation. Before I do anything else, I'm going to go to the bottom, the button at the bottom of the HTML document on line 48, and let's give our button a name. So let's add, actually not a name, but let's tap into the on-click event of this button because that's what buttons are for. People click on them, right? So there's an on-click event or method. Most times we'll say event. So that on-click event goes into the button tag on line 48 as an attribute. And the value of it will be a JavaScript function. So I'm going to enter in a validate function here. Let's add in the semicolon at the end. Now I have not written this function as yet, but let's hit Control S on the keyboard to save our changes. Now let me head over to scripts.js where I will write that function. Now notice that we have a function here already. This is from a previous demonstration. Let's add in our new function now using the keyword function. Let's give our function a name. So remember, I'm supposed to be calling it validate. Let's add in our curly braces, and now we can write in the logic for our validate function. So before I write the validate function, what I'd like to do here is I'd like to make sure that the user has checked on one of the radio buttons. Notice that we have a yes or no answer in a checkbox, not checkbox, but radio buttons. And if I go to the demo.html file, I'm clicking on that now in Notepad++. Let's see, on line 42 and 43, we have our 2 radio buttons. One is a yes, one is a no. However, notice something. Both of them have the same name. They're both named with the like. I've added the like there. Like is something that I've made up. Name is a keyword that comes with HTML, so we can't use that to name any variables. But I can name my variables like. So notice I have 2 radio buttons. One represents yes, one represents no. And they're both named the same word, like. Let's head back over into JavaScript now and see how we can figure this out. Let us add in an if structure. And what we'll do is we'll take our feedback form. Now, by the way, once I've created a name for my form, then that form becomes the parent for some of the other controls, form controls on this document. So for example, I can do feedback.like. And with that like, I'm able to tap into the radio button that I created. Now that the radio button has properties on it, like the checked property. And that checked property can be either true or false. So I'm checking for false in this instance. Now, there's a problem here because we have 2 likes. So how do we solve that? Well, it just so happens that the DOM solves this problem for us, because when the DOM sees 2 items, 2 form controls, for example, with the same name, it automatically puts those names into an array. And if you remember anything about array, we know that the first item in the array is always numbered 0. The second one will be numbered 1. So our like at this point on line number 7 is an array. So what we need to do is we need to indicate that to JavaScript. We need to tell JavaScript that, hey, I'd like you to check the very first radio button for me. Check the checked property and see if it's false. So far, so good. Now remember, there are 2 buttons. So what we need to do with this if statement on line number 7 is first of all wrap up the first check. So let's wrap up this first check into parentheses. And then we'll use the ampersand. And then we can add in now the second check. So the second check will also be in parentheses. And again, this will be feedback.like. But this time it's going to be like 1. Because like 0 would represent yes, and like 1 will represent no. So again, we're going to check for the checked property and make sure that it is false or maybe not false. So then what we're saying here is that if both of these are false, we wanted to do something. So this is our validation. We wanted to alert the user. So what we'll do is we'll add in an alert in the logic of the if block, and we'll simply say you must check yes or no. So let's see how this works. If I click Control S on the keyboard to save those changes back on my HTML document, again, I'll do a hard refresh just to make sure I have everything. I'll add in Axel for the favorite instructor, and for favorite course, let's just go with C#. So that's enough for the 6 characters. Now I'm not going to check any of the radio buttons, yes or no. If I click on Send now, notice I get a message. It says you must check yes or no. So I'll click OK there. I'll check no for now, and if I click on Send now, oh well, our values got erased. So let's put in our values again. So Axel and C#, and now the form should be submitted. In this demonstration, we're going to work with something called pattern recognition. It's a new feature of HTML5. On the left of your screen, we've got our Notepad++. We've got 3 files opened up there. On the right of your screen, we have our Firefox web browser. It will render any changes we make to either of the 3 files. And this is an example that I've used for previous demonstrations. And if you remember, for a previous demonstration, we were turning all of our characters that we entered into our 2 input boxes on the form. We were turning those into uppercase letters. Now, I removed that feature from our styles.css file. I'm going to click on styles.css file just to show you where that change was made. Notice that between lines 9 and 12, I've commented out that entire block of code. So now our text transform on line number 11 will not operate anymore, so we can enter in lowercase letters. I'm going to switch now to my scripts.js file, and if you remember from another demonstration, we had an alert every time the user tried to submit the form without clicking on the yes or no radio buttons. I have now commented out that line number 8 in the function called validate. Let's focus now on demo.html. And previously, I had quite a few validations on our 2 input boxes. I have removed all of those validations. So now we don't have anything on either the instructor name or course name. I'd like to focus on the course name. This is where I'm going to add in my regular expression, which is now part of pattern recognition. And the way we do this is with an attribute. So let's add in the attribute called pattern, and we will point that to double quotation marks. Then in between the double quotation marks, we add square brackets. Whatever pattern we'd like our HTML5 to recognize must go in between these square brackets. Now, the first pattern that I'd like my input box, my favorite course, to recognize is the letters A to Z in uppercase. So let's add those in. Notice it starts with an A on the left side, a Z on the right side, and a dash in the middle. That means anything between A and Z. However, this is all uppercase, but in reality, we would also like the input box to recognize lowercase letters. So let's add that in next to our first A to Z. So in this case, we can accept anything from A to Z in either uppercase or lowercase. Let's save this now, refresh our browser screen, and this won't work at the moment because I'd never entered an amount, a quantity. So we'll add that in a moment. But just to show you, if I were to enter A and A, both one uppercase, one lowercase, try to send it, it will tell me that we did not match the requested format. So let's go ahead now and add in some kind of a quantity. And the way you would do that is with curly braces, something like that. And I can enter, for example, the number 1 and save it. So meaning I would accept either an uppercase letter or a lowercase letter, and I'm only going to accept 1. So let's refresh our browser screen and try to send 1 letter, and notice it went. But if I did AA, click on send, that did not match. So we're only matching 1 at the moment. However, you would definitely want to match more than 1 characters, right? So we would like to match either 1 or anything after that. So in other words, 1 or multiple characters. Let's click Control S now, and let's refresh our browser screen. And if I click on send, notice that now we're able to accept multiple characters. By the way, we could also enter in an upper limit, meaning that we will not accept anything more than, let's say, 15 characters. Now, we do offer courses here, and one of our courses is C++. So how can we have our users enter that plus sign? Well, we could do it by adding another pair of square brackets, and we could enter in the plus sign in there, meaning that we will now accept the plus sign. So let's save our changes so far, refresh our browser screen. In fact, let's just do a hard refresh here. And now if I enter something like C++ and I click on send, it still did not match. And that's because we also have to add in some kind of a quantity for our plus sign. Again, we can do that using curly braces. So I'll add in my curly braces. And now how many plus signs do we expect? Well, we know that only 1 course exists, and that's C++. At least only 1 course with that plus sign exists. So what we could do is we can say, okay, we'll accept anything from 0 or 2 characters. So either you don't enter into that plus sign, or you enter in at least 2 plus signs. Otherwise, not everything else will fail. There's one more thing to notice here. Notice that the plus sign in square brackets comes after the A to Z, meaning that we won't be able to enter in that plus sign either in the middle of some alphabetic set that we're entering. It won't accept it. We have to enter in that plus sign at the end of the set that we're entering. So let's save our changes by hitting Control S on the keyboard. Back over in our browser, let's do a hard refresh. And now if I enter something like C++ and I click on send, notice that it took. So the C++ did in fact go. But if I were to enter something like C and click on the send, that will also go, because either I enter 2 plus signs or none at all. Now this is a very simple pattern that I've entered in my favorite course input box, but these patterns can get very complex. And if it did get extremely complex, then you would probably want to use JavaScript in connection with regular expressions for any kind of complicated situations that you may encounter. But at least for now, we do have this pattern attribute, and we could enter in very simple situations like the one I have here. In this demonstration, we're going to work with JavaScript dates. What we have on the left of your screen is our Notepad++. We've got 3 files opened up there. We've used these files for previous demonstrations. On the right side of your screen, we have Firefox. It will render any changes we make to either of those 3 files, and I will be working with all 3 files in this video. So what I'm trying to accomplish here is to be able to show the user a date. So where it says here are our courses, I'd like to, on the right side of that, I'd like to insert a date there. So every time the page is loaded, the current date will show up in this area. Let's head over to our HTML document and see how we can accomplish this. Notice that on line 12, or line 13 actually, that's where we have a pair of p tags where we have our prompt. Here are our courses. I'm going to use that area. In fact, I'm going to turn that into a div. And so we'll use a div instead, but let's give our div an ID. In fact, this pair of divs that I've entered on lines 13 and 14, this will have an ID of course intro, and this will act as our parent div. We can target this div via CSS and split up the 2 inner divs. So the inner div, the first inner div, will have the same label that we had before. Here are our courses. And we'll have another div underneath that. So two pairs of divs inside of our parent div on line 13. And this will also have an ID because we need to target this div on line 15 with our JavaScript file. So on line 15, we have an ID of date today, but let's also put in a prompt. So we're going to have a prompt of today, and then we'll insert the date right after the colon. Let's save these changes now and refresh our browser to see what we have. So we still have our, what was before p tag. It's now a pair of div tags with some textual content inside of it. And then we have another div tag with the today right below it. Let's head over now to our styles.css file and see how we can configure our two inner divs. Notice that on line 13 we have our favorites style there. That's what's making the style or producing the style that we have for favorite instructor and favorite course. In other words, it produced a grid with two columns in it. We're going to be copying that style now. So let's see, on line 22, let's target our course intro there. Remember, that's the parent div. And let's turn that, or let's add some styles to it. So the display is going to be grid just like line 14. Also, we'll copy line 15 directly. So grid template column of 1FR, 1FR. Now we're also going to copy line 16, but the width or the sizes will be different. So grid template rows on line 25 will be 20 pixels each. Then we will have our padding of 5 pixels, and I'll save those changes. Let's now take a look at the browser. Let's refresh our browser and notice that we have our label on the left and the today prompt on the right. So where it says today, we should be able to insert our dates there. Now there's one more thing I need to do with demo.html. We need to target the onload event of the body tag. So that means when the page is loaded, we can run our function, JavaScript function, to produce that date. So take a look at line number 10. Remember, we have the onload event that we can use there. So once we point it to a JavaScript function, that function will run every time the document is loaded in the browser. Now it is a function, so let's add in our parentheses as well as a semicolon at the end. Now I believe I'm done with the demo.html, so I'll save those changes and let's head over now to the scripts.js file. Notice that I've already written the function called showDate. What we're going to be doing first of all, though, on line number 2 is grabbing the date today. Every time this page loads, the date today will be loaded up with whatever the date is on that date. Then we have our showDate function. Remember, this is the function that we're calling every time the document is loaded. So every time the document is loaded, the date today will be calculated from JavaScript. And on line 15, what I have is I'm using the DOM again, get element by ID. I am targeting that date today div tag, and I'm putting it into a variable. So this showDate now on line 15 is actually going to get us the div tag as an object. Once we get our div tag as an object, then we can access the inner HTML of that object, of that div tag. Remember, if we pass content into that inner HTML, then that content will show in the browser between the tags. So on line number 17, this is my first method of getting the date. I have 4 different methods here of working with JavaScript dates. Line number 17 is the first one. So I'll comment out line number 17, and again we're using the div tags as an object, and inner HTML is a property of that. And then what we're pointing that to is the first formatted date that we're going to be using. Now it says date today, and remember our date today will actually get the date as it is when the browser is loaded. One more thing to notice here is that instead of just an equal sign, I have a plus equal sign. That means that I'd like to keep whatever we had in between the div tags, and what we have between the div tags is our prompt. It says today with a colon. So I'd like that to stay in the finished content between the div tags once inner HTML runs. So that's why I added in a plus there. Then I'm going to take the date, which is date today. I'm going to get the month, then the day, and finally the year. And I'm going to string all of those together, concatenate them using that /. Once I get all of that, I can then pass all that entire string over to inner HTML. And if I save this change, if I refresh the browser, notice it says August 30th, 2021. Now, if I did not have this plus sign there, if I just had the equal sign, so let's save that change. I deleted the plus sign, just left the equal sign. If I refresh the browser now, notice that we don't have the prompt of today. So let's put that plus sign back in, and let's now move on to the next date. So let's put a comment for at line number 17, and line number 18, I'll show you a different way of getting the date. Notice this one says to local date string. So again, I'm still using the date from today that JavaScript gave me from line number 2, and I'm actually adding on the to local date string. So to local date string is a property of date today. And what that is going to do is we can pass it some configuration. So for example, I'm saying I'd like the Indian style of dates in English, and I'm passing it a configuration object. I'm saying, okay, I want the entire day of the week. So if it's Thursday, I need that to be Thursday. If it's Wednesday, I need it to be Wednesday. Then after that, I'm passing in the year, month, and the day. Let's save this change by hitting Control S on the keyboard, refreshing our browser screen, and notice it says Thursday, 30th of September 2021. Let's head back over to scripts.js and take a look at the third option for dates. So line 19, I've uncommented that out. Again, I'm using date today, which gives me the date today from JavaScript. And this time, I'm accessing the toISO string method. Now, I'm also adding on a slice method, and it looks kind of weird, but this dot slice here, which is a method, we know it's a method or a function because it has the parentheses. So you might be wondering, why is there a parenthesis? Why is there a method added on to another method with a dot in the middle? This is called chaining. So what we're doing now in JavaScript, it's possible to chain one method onto another method. And that's exactly what this is. So using this toISO string, let's save that change, refresh the browser, and see that we get the date in a sort of a shortened format with the year first. Now this is all pre-configured for us. We simply have to use it. Let's put a comment on line number 19, head down to the last date format. And by the way, there are several more date formats. I'm just showing you just a few. So in this case, on line 20, what we have is we're taking the today date, turning it, accessing it via the toISO string, and then we're chaining on a split function, repassing it a couple of parameters, and let's save that change, refresh the browser screen, and notice that we still get the same date like we did before. So nothing much has changed. So these are 4 different ways of getting dates or working with dates with JavaScript. In this demonstration, I'm going to work with the math object. This is an object that comes free with every browser. It is part of JavaScript. On the left of your screen, we have 3 files opened up. On the right of your screen, we have our Firefox web browser. Anytime I make any change to the files on the left of your screen with a notepad, we will render our Firefox web browser to see the effect of that change. So back over on the left, let us start with these files. Now I've used these files before. However, I've removed a lot of the div tags and other forms and things like that. And I just wanted to concentrate on the math functions. Now, if we take a look at line 14, we have a div there with an ID of favorites. It is that area that I'm going to use to display the results of working with the math object. Now, I've already created a function in my scripts.javascript file, I'll show you that in a moment, where I am working with several of these functions. Now, in order to call that function on line 22, where we have our button, I have used the onClick event of that button, and I'm pointing that onClick event to the calculate this method, which I just wrote, and it's in the scripts.javascript file. Now, every time I run this function, I'll be using the math object to utilize one of its functions, and I'll pass the result back and populate our div tag here in line number 17. Let's take a look now at our scripts.javascript file, and notice that we have our function here, calculate this. There are several functions that have been commented out, but I'd like to take you now to line 13. With line 13, what we're doing is we're trying to access the div tag with the ID of result, and return that as an object, and therefore we can access the inner HTML of that object. We can then populate the inner HTML of that object with whatever we have resulted from our various math operations. So let's start with line number 3. I will remove the comments from that line, and let's take a look at what this is doing. We've got our math object, and we are accessing the round method. So this is rounding. So back from our algebra days, we know that anything less than 5 will be rounded down. Anything greater than 5 will be rounded up. So here we're using the math object. We're accessing the round function, and we're passing it a value of 8.2. So this should round down to 8. Let's save our changes, and let's refresh our browser screen to accept the change, and then click on the Send button. And notice that we have 8. If I were to change this to, let's say, 8.6, save those changes, refresh the browser again to accept those changes, then click on Send, notice that it was rounded up to 9. Let's take a look at the square root function. So I'll put a comment from the first result. Let's comment out line number 4, where we're using the math object again, but this time we're accessing the sqrt function. So that's square root. So I'm passing the value of 81 into square root. I expect to get 9 from that number. So let's save that change, refresh the browser screen, click on Send, and we do in fact get 9. As a matter of fact, let's change our number again to, let's say, 144. Save that change, refresh the browser screen, click on Send, and now we get 12. Let's take a look now at the absolute function. So let's comment line number 4, uncomment line number 5. And here we have the abs function. It is a function that's got parentheses, and we're passing it minus 81. Let's save our change. So what we should get then is just the number 81. Let's refresh our browser screen to accept the change, click on Send, and we get 81. Let's take a look now at seal. So let's comment out line number 5, uncomment out line number 6, and the sealing, what it'll do is it'll just go up to the next number above what it's seeing. So it's seeing 8.2, so it will sort of round up to 9, and that's the seal function. But of course, this is not the round function, this is a seal function. So whatever you pass to it, it will simply go up to the next level. Unless we pass something like 8, it will remain as 8. So let's save that change, refresh the browser screen, click on Send, and notice that it went all the way up to 9, even though we passed in 8.2. Now, the next function down does the opposite. So I'll put a comment on line number 6, uncomment out line number 7, where we have our floor function. Notice that I'm passing it 8.9. So the floor function will simply move backwards to the next lower digit, next lower integer, which will be 8 in this case. Let's save our change, refresh the browser screen, click on Send, and notice that we get an 8. Our next function, trunc, let's first of all put a comment for line number 7, remove the comment from line number 8. The trunc method or function will take whatever you give it, in this case a decimal, 8.5289. It will simply strip out the decimal part and return to you the pure integer. Let's save that change, refresh the browser screen, click on Send, and notice we get 8. So everything else was removed from our value. Now the next function that we have is interesting, but first I'll comment back out line number 8, remove the comments from line number 9, and notice that we've passed into the min function a few values. We have 8, 9, and 5. What the min function is going to do is it will compare all these numbers, these integers that I just passed in, and it'll return the lowest number, which should be 5. Let's save our changes, refresh the browser screen, click on Send, and we do in fact get 5. Now the max function will be just the opposite, so I'll comment out the max function, put a comment for the min function, save our change, refresh the browser screen. Now we should get 9, and in fact we do. Now a lot of these functions, let's put a comment back on line number 10, remove the comments from line number 11. A lot of these functions you may never use in your day-to-day activities. But the random function is something that you will always use. So what the random function does is it will give you a random number between 0 and 1. Let's see how that works. I'll click on Save. So I've uncommented out line number 11, which has the random function in it. Notice that nothing is passed into random. Over in the browser, I'll refresh, and I'll click on Send, and notice that we did get a random number. Now if I click on Send again, notice I got a different random number. I'll click again, and notice I got a different one. So we will always get a random number when we ever call that function random from the math object. So these are just a few methods that I've shown you here. There are several more methods of the math object, but these are just the ones that we can get started with. In this demonstration, I'm going to work with JavaScript classes and objects. On the left side of your screen, we have our Notepad++ showing a few files that I've used in previous demonstrations. On the right side of your screen, we have Firefox web browser rendering any changes I make to the files that you see on the left. So what I'd like to do in this demonstration is I'd like to access the onClick event of our drop-down list box. So whenever the user clicks on one of these courses, I want to pop up at the bottom that the course being taught by a particular instructor. So we're going to have to use obviously a div tag, part of the DOM, and we can access it and then pass in the sentence this course is being taught by, for example, Axel Bar. So on the HTML document, notice that we have our select tag on line 19. That's our drop-down list box. I want to now access the onClick event. Remember, the DOM has several events on it. In order to do that, though, I would have to use or apply the onChange event or access the onChange event and point it to a function, choiceMade. Now, I haven't written this function as yet, but I'm going to shortly in our JavaScript file. It's a function, so let's add in our parentheses as well as the semicolon. Now, when I call the choiceMade function in JavaScript, what do I want to pass to it? I'd like to pass to it the value that the user has chosen. So for example, if they chose Vue, I would like this value of Vue.js to be passed into that function. So therefore, I need to make sure that I use the this operator or the this keyword and let it know which item I want to pass into the choiceMade function. The property that I'd like to pass in is the value property. In other words, I'm saying this select box, this drop-down list box with an ID of courses, when the user makes a choice, I want the value to be passed into my choiceMade function. So the value will be one of Angular, React, Vue, etc. Now let's save the changes on the HTML document, move over to our scripts.javascript file, and notice that I already have the variable declared and initialized because we only have one instructor. That instructor is Axel Bar. But let us now create our class. We're going to use the class keyword, give the class a name. Usually, if you're creating a class, the name will be in uppercase, the first letter is uppercase. And curly braces will then be used to define the class body. Now, like any other class, in JavaScript, our classes do have constructors. So let's create a constructor. It's a special function, and curly braces as well. Now, in the constructor, we are expecting two things. We would like to get the course name from that drop-down list box when the user clicks on it. And we'd also like to pass into this course class an instructor. Now, we only have one, the one on line 2, so that will be passed in. Now, once it's passed in, we would like to take the values that were passed in and assign those values to the classes variables. So we have to sort of make a separation between the variables that belong to this class and the values that are coming via the variables in the constructor. So we do that by prepending the this keyword. So if I say this.course name, I'm talking about the course name that belongs to the class called course. Now I can assign it with the course name that I'm getting from the user when the user clicks that drop-down list box. Let's do the same thing with instructor. This.instructor means the instructor of this course class. That's going to be assigned with the instructor that was passed in as a string whenever the user clicked that one of the drop-down lists that we have. So we're done with the constructor. We've done all of the assigning that we could do. Now let's create a function. So a function is written just like other functions. In fact, you don't use the function keyword. You simply write out the name of the method. So it's called about, and it has parentheses as well as curly braces. And inside of the about function or method, we can then define what we want this about method to do. What I want my about method to do is to pass back to whichever part of the code is calling this course class. I like it to pass back some information about this course or the course that was created. So the course that was created, we're going to return this dot course name, which we had on line 5. We initiated that there, plus some kind of a sentence, some words that will make up a sentence. So let's say something like is being taught by. then the last concatenation will be this dot instructor name, or instructor in this case. So now we have a class called course that can be used by any part of our JavaScript. In fact, let's now create that function that I mentioned when we were talking about the demo.html file. Remember, there was a function called a choice made. Whenever the user clicked on one of the courses in our drop-down list box, this function will fire off. By the way, the class that I just created on line 3, that will just sit there. Nothing will ever come of it unless we do something with it, unless we instantiate it and create an object out of it, which is what we're going to be doing now with choice made. So with choice made, let's complete it, and also let us pass to the, actually with choice made, we're accepting a parameter. If you remember, when we clicked on the drop-down list box, I'm saying I'm going to be passing in this dot value. So let's capture this dot value here in choice made. So basically what I'm saying is that once they click on Angular or React or Vue, that would be the course chosen. So they click on something, this choice made function will fire off, and whatever they click on will be passed in to choice made. Therefore, I have access to it within choice made. So I can say, I can create now a new variable called course, current course, and I can point it to the course on line 3. I can use the new operator to instantiate that course, meaning a current course on line 14 will now be an object of the course class. So what I can do here now is, well, let's finish this sentence first on line 14, or this line of code. And what I can do now is whenever I call that course object, course class, I need to pass it two things. I need to pass the course name and the instructor. Now remember, the course name that I'm getting will be clicked on by the user. So that's chosen course, or course chosen. The instructor happens to be already defined in this JavaScript class. So it's on line 2, which is instructor. So now line 14 will give me back an object of the course class. Now I can do whatever I want with that object. I can use that object, which is now named current course. Before we get to current course, let's first of all access the div tag where I'm going to be displaying information about the course. So remember, it's document.getElementById, and then we'll pass in the name of the div tag that I want to target, and then we'll target the inner HTML. So if you remember, the name of the div tag that we wanted to target on demo.html is course info. Let's head over back to demo.html real quick, and I'll show you where that is. Notice on line 29, there's a pair of div tags there with an ID of course info. So it is this area that I'm going to enter in my course information once they click on one of the drop-down list box choices. Let's head back over to scripts.js and let us complete line number 15. So now I'm accessing that div tag. So I can use the inner HTML property, and I can pass to it our current course, but not just the current course, because the current course represents the object. What I'd like to pass to this inner HTML, this div tag, is the about function. And it's a function, so let's include the parentheses. Now I'll hit Control S on the keyboard to save all of my JavaScript changes. Now back over in the browser, if I refresh, I'll accept those changes. And now if I click on, let's say, Python, notice it says Python is being taught by Axel Bar. By the way, I did add a little bit of CSS so that this line will stand out. If I click on JavaScript, it would say JavaScript is being taught by Axel Bar. So whatever I click on will be passed into the choice made function, and it will get passed up into the course class, and that now becomes an object. During this course, we saw that we can use JavaScript to create dynamic web pages. With JavaScript, we have what is considered to be a client-side scripting programming language. JavaScript is used in the browser. We saw that we can insert JavaScript by using the script tags on the browser. With JavaScript, we can do what is called client-side validation of user input. A lot of the times, we're going to ask our users to give us data, especially using forms. When users enter that data, we can use JavaScript to validate that data, make sure that it's within a certain range, or maybe the data that they're giving us follows a specific pattern. We used JavaScript in the course to create arrays. These are special variables. They hold multiple values. And we saw that JavaScript came with a lot of functions on its own. However, we can also write our own custom functions. Then we saw that we can use JavaScript to format the dates that come with JavaScript. And I showed you several different ways of formatting JavaScript dates. We also used JavaScript and looked at some of the math functions that came with JavaScript. In other words, once you have a browser and you have JavaScript available to you, you will have these math functions. In the next course in this series, we're going to take a look at database concepts. Database will help us store the data that we're trying to collect from our users, especially via the forms that we create. So databases are used to store data. We'll also have a look at what's called relational database management systems, where the tables that we write to collect data are all related together. We'll also be looking at SQL and especially queries to query our data for specific pieces of information.